Good evening, comrades. Welcome. Welcome to Working Class Revolt. I'm William Morrison, your British Marxist-Leninist and anti-imperialist, and I'll be chairing this evening's live stream. Hope you're all doing well, and thanks for clicking on to this live, and thanks for watching. This live stream is going to be slightly different to our usual stuff. It's not really a study. It's also not really a work meeting. This live stream will be dedicated to talking about healthcare, with an emphasis on the NHS and American healthcare. But just a general conversation about healthcare in general and how socialist healthcare is superior to capitalist healthcare. But first of all, we're going to introduce our guests. First of all, we have Dust James from North Carolina. How are you doing, Dust?
Thank you, brother. Glad to be here.
Thank you. It's good to have you. And moving on to our second co-host from Australia, David Fox, union organizer and veteran of the workers' movement. How are you doing, David?
Very good, thank you.
Cheers, thank you. And good morning, Helen. Thank you for being here. And our third guest today is my CPGBML and Workers' Party Britain comrade, Sophia from England. How are you doing, Sophia?
Yeah, good, thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you for being here. So, like I said, this live stream is going to be dedicated to just kind of talking about healthcare, with an emphasis on the NHS. Myself and Sophia are both British comrades, and since I'm chairing this live stream, just want to have a little, just kind of raise some conversation, raise some awareness for the NHS. What is the NHS? Its origin story, how it was created, and stuff like that. So hopefully it's going to be an interesting live stream, and I'm looking forward to jumping right in. So first of all, what is the NHS? Well, the NHS is the National Health Service of Britain. It's our main healthcare system, and it's public and it's accessible to the public. Absolutely anyone who needs medical attention can receive it pretty much at first hand whenever they need it. And that could be anything from prescriptions to cancer treatments to abortions to IVF treatment for women who want to get pregnant, to accident and emergency. If you have an emergency, you can go to A&E, accident and emergency, and you will be treated. The NHS is an amazing thing, and one of the slogans back in the day when it was first created was "to the cradle, from the cradle to the grave," meaning that pretty much, since your first day of being on the planet to your very last, when you're dying of old age, the NHS will be there for you to help you whenever you need to be helped. So when you're first born, when you're getting like your infantile vaccinations and stuff, when you're getting your immunizations, all throughout school to dental care. In primary schools in Britain, you have free dental care. People come into your schools, they check how healthy your teeth are. They ask you if you have a healthy diet and a healthy balanced diet. This is all part of our free education system here in Britain. Well, I mean, it's not free; it's paid for the taxpayers. Essentially, everybody in Britain pays tax, and it's chipped into the government, and the government use that tax money to reinvest into the healthcare system. So it all works out, and it saves hundreds of thousands of people every single year in Britain, thankfully. And it ranges all sorts of things. Like I said, if women want to have abortions, they are allowed to do that free from the NHS. Cancer patients, obviously, they receive surgeries and chemotherapy. That's all free. That's all paid for them by the taxpayer. They don't have to pay a single thing towards that. And what it means is that nobody goes into debt. Nobody has to really worry about finances when they're going through tough times in their life. People could be going through the worst thing in their life. They could be going through an absolute crisis medically, or in regards to their physical well-being or mental health being. Mental health is a major part of the NHS too. Anything, they could be going through an absolute crisis, and one thing that they won't have to worry about while receiving treatment is paying money, having to pay money to receive treatment. It's something that they don't have to worry about. It's one problem off their chest out of many that they may have. So it's an amazing thing. So that's kind of what the NHS is. It's the British public healthcare system, and the idea behind it is that it's there for you whenever you need it. You know, wherever you are in Britain, there'll be something close that you can use close by. I'm not sure if Sophia wants to add anything to that, or if I can move on to the next point. But that's kind of all I have to say for now. It's an amazing thing. It's inherently socialistic.
Yeah, completely agree, William. Yeah, we almost take it a bit for granted, don't we? And it's not a left or right thing. It's not a Labour or Conservative. It's everyone. If British people love their NHS, and it's healthcare is highly emotive. So of course it's used as a bit of a political football at every election. But we'll go into what has happened to our NHS, but we all want it to be here for us in the future. So it's really, really important we rally behind it and make sure it isn't completely decimated.
Absolutely right, Sophia. I completely agree with you that it's definitely something that we take for granted, and it's something that transcends like the kind of left-right paradigm. People like Nigel Farage have openly, they absolutely, even he absolutely loves the NHS and what it stands for. He absolutely loves it. Most people, even right-wing conservatives have used the NHS at some point in their life and have needed it at some point in their life. And it's been there for them, just like it's there for anyone else. It's not a political thing. The NHS is not a political institution. It's a healthcare system. It's completely separate. It's health. It's not political. It's there for anyone, whoever needs it. So if David and Dust don't have anything else to kind of add to that or want to ask any questions, I'll move on to the history of the creation of the NHS.
I just wanted to respond. Like, this is completely foreign to me. I mean, we had Bernie Sanders run, who was like a fringe populist candidate that was like, unprecedented in recent American history. And he was red baited as a crazy left wing communist that was going to destroy America because he wanted to have not even a socialized medicine system like the NHS, but simply more like a Medicare for all system like they have in Australia. So, I mean, this is absolutely refreshing to hear. And I have, you guys know my theory on the junior imperialist powers, on how why I think there's more of a welfare state in Europe and the United Kingdom is not because the American people, not a fault with the fight back in the American people, but the absolute domination of the monopolies in the American political system. The McCarthy period, COINTELPRO, the systematic destruction of the union movement. It's interesting. We both bribed off and suppressed simultaneously. So it's an interesting mix.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dust. And on you go, David.
I was just wondering, with the NHS, does that cover like elective surgery to major surgery like open heart surgery, for example, or something major like that? And you mentioned also too, does it cover all comprehensive dental care?
Yeah, it does. All of that is paid for the NHS.
Wow.
So you could choose. So it's not even necessarily the fact that if you need the NHS, you can choose to have stuff done to you, and the NHS can do it. I don't know the rules about plastic surgery and stuff. I don't know if that's kind of cosmetic. I'm not sure if the NHS, you have to go private for that. But for IVF, if you go to the NHS and say that you want to have IVF to have a baby, you can get like 3 cycles of that for free. After that, you will have to go private if it doesn't work. But you get a good 3 cycles. And with the technology we have now, the success rates of IVF are getting more and more successful. So 3 should probably be enough. For transgender people, they can legally get the relevant surgery to transition into the gender that they identify as. So that's for free too. So this is all free, paid for the NHS. Open heart surgery, all of these major surgeries, it's free. There's not really anything. I think, like I mentioned earlier, the one thing that's exclusive is kind of cosmetic kind of surgery. That's private. You know, if you want to get plastic surgery or Botox and stuff like that, you'll probably have to pay for that. But everything else is completely free. And yeah, I just wanted to address something that Dust said. Yeah, everyone in America and even here, you know, the media here said that Bernie Sanders was like this extremely left-wing kind of communist. He wanted to Bolshevize Bolshevize the United States. And that's not true at all. The kind of healthcare program that Bernie Sanders was advocating for wasn't even remotely close to the NHS, what we have here. It was slightly more extreme than like Obamacare. It was slightly more than that, but even then, it was not even that. It wasn't that radical at all. And to us British people, it was still essentially private healthcare he was advocating for. Like you said, the monopolies of the pharmaceutical companies and stuff were still going to be the big winners under a Bernie government, 100%. So yeah, it's it's quite funny you say that. How everyone thought he was going to be like the next big thing, and he was going to Bolshevize and communistify America, and you know what he was advocating for was like very, very like minor social democracy or a junior imperialism, as you'd call it in Europe. It's insane. But I'll move on to our next topic, which is the creation of the NHS. How was the NHS created? There was quite a few factors that I want to talk about that actually helped bring about the NHS. First and foremost was the pressure from the trade union movement. There was massive pressures on the current government to make kind of a more welfare state, especially post-World War II. People started taking their human rights a lot more seriously. Civilians, just normal citizens, started taking their liberty a little bit more seriously. Seeing how Hitler had treated his own people in Germany, and the global war that ensued after that, the fight against Nazism and fascism. After World War II and after the Nazis were defeated, a lot of people all over the world started seriously thinking about what rights they had, what protections they had against their own governments to make sure that nothing like that ever happened again. So here in Britain, our reaction to that was a massive trade union movement that put massive pressure on the government to install a kind of healthcare system that gave people basic protections. If they had, if they got the cold or the flu, they could just go to the doctors and they'd get a prescription for some antibiotics or paracetamol, some painkillers, and they wanted that for free. That was kind of what it started off as. It was a tiny little small idea, a tiny step, but workers piled into that movement very, very enthusiastically. It was a massive snowball effect. Hundreds of thousands of people in Britain, workers all up and down the country, marched and demonstrated and put immense pressure on the government to make up a public healthcare system that really, really actually cared about the healthcare of their people, the physical well-being. Not so much mental health care back then, obviously, but it's maybe PTSD and stuff like that from the war, but mainly just physical health. Treating viruses, treating flus, treating injuries from the war and stuff. That was kind of the idea behind it back then. Obviously now it's added arms and legs. It's become this huge, all-encompassing thing. It treats anyone for whatever reason. But yeah, one of the reasons why it exists today is by massive pressure from the socialists and communists and trade union movement, who put immense pressure on the government. And also the Communist Party. Both communists, well, back then the political landscape of the communist parties were slightly different, but the CPGB and other kind of supportive communist organizations made a massive coalition, a massive communist coalition. The Communist Party of Britain had about 60,000 members at this time. The CPGB had about 75,000. So shared between them, we were talking about around 100,000 people in Britain who were members of a communist party, and they joined together under one banner, and that one slogan was free healthcare for all. It was a pretty simple, and obviously, knowing what's happened now, very, very popular slogan, very, very popular demand. So yeah, essentially it was a snowball effect. Communists and trade unionists and workers alike all joined together to fight for their right for healthcare, and they were extremely successful. But not only domestically, there was international humiliation going on. At this time, there was the Warsaw Pact. We had the socialist states in the Warsaw Pact. Countries that weren't really thought of much before World War II had now turned into extremely successful socialist regimes, and had a healthcare system that was way more superior than Britain at the time. Countries like Albania under Enver Hoxha. Before World War II, nobody even really cared about Albania. They were a tiny country, not much significance from a British perspective. We didn't talk about them. Under Enver Hoxha, seeing the success of their healthcare system, the government really started to get humiliated. Albanian citizens were able to get free prescriptions for antibiotics, and they had abortions for women, and they had all this, wonderful stuff that just helped people get by on a daily basis. And that was Albania, from a British perspective back then, a fairly small and insignificant country, and they were leading the world back then with healthcare. Even East Germany, the People's Republic of Deutschland, East Germany, their education system was absolutely amazing. They had codified anti-racist and anti-sexist laws. They helped immigrants and refugees. They had free healthcare even for defectors. If people from Western Europe fled and came to East Germany, they would get the same treatment and healthcare as anyone else. It was completely free and equal. East Germany was one of the most egalitarian countries to ever exist, even nowadays. So it was wonderful stuff. The British were seeing this and seeing this happening, and they were utterly humiliated. The sheer success of healthcare under the socialist regimes was just too humiliating. And once the workers, started seeing this reality, they started waking up to the fact that, well, wait a minute, if they can get it, if Albanians fought for it and they had a revolution and they have the good leader Enver Hoxha, and they can get all this free stuff that actually helps my life improve, then why can't we have it here in Britain? So they fought for it, but it was just major humiliation. Even the Soviet Union, our enemy, our nemesis, the evil communists of the Soviet Union, the secret authoritarian, dystopian, just evil maniacs in the Soviet Union, they had free healthcare. They were leading the world in medical technology and medicine and vaccinations and drugs and stuff. They were leading the world in that back then. And Britain, in the regard of healthcare, was lacking behind. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, me and Sophia, about what Britain was like before the NHS. But it was really humiliating for Britain at this point, and that was also a factor that really helped the British government implement some sort of healthcare system. And that was the embryonic stage of creating the NHS. Just the absolute humiliation, the pressure from the trade unions, the pressure from the workers, people really starting to just take their liberties and civil rights seriously. This all came together in the same time, and it was the right time, the right place, and then boom, pretty much. It took a lot of fighting and a lot of struggle and a lot of determination. Lots of trade unionists were imprisoned and arrested in this country. Hunger strikes went on. There were so many marches. There were so many different campaigns all fighting for the same thing. It was inherently and naturally grassroots movement. And pretty much the main two factors were just domestic pressure from workers and international humiliation. Tiny, insignificant countries leading the world in healthcare, and Britain was getting left behind, and we couldn't allow that. So that was essentially it. That's kind of my take on it. I don't know if Sophia wants to add any of that, but we are certainly going to move on to what Britain was like before the NHS. But if anyone wants to butt in just before I do that, then you can go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say we literally owe the NHS to the October Revolution, like you said. The rollout of universal healthcare provision in the Soviet Union, and the drastic improvement of the lives of people in the Soviet Union over that time, in a time of great economic crisis, in a time of the Great Depression. Like William said, the Communist Party was building here. There was lots of strikes, there was a lot of action, but really, truly, the capitalist class in this country were absolutely terrified. They're terrified that of a British Bolshevism, like William said. Like they were the welfare capitalism they implemented after World War II was really to just crush the revolutionary path. And so the NHS, I would say, is really, we've got to thank the October Revolution and the Soviets for, because that is why we were pushing back so extensively. But yeah, it was pretty grim. It was very grim before the NHS. Like, you know, made Oliver Twist look like a bit of a summer camp, really. You either, it was either you depended on charity or you had income. So if you had money, you could get a doctor come and see you could afford healthcare. If not, you depended on charity, and or you had the workhouses, which were just places of terror. They were, you know, prisons for the poor, they used to call them. So a lot of people would rather, you know, kill themselves rather than go into a workhouse. A lot of stigma attached as well, or especially when they became sick or were elderly, they'll decide, right, it's better off I kill myself than be a burden to my family. So the state of things were very bad. But like William said, leading up to, I think, between 1911 and 1914, there was the great unrest. So there was lots of strikes. You have the suffragettes as well. And they're all looking to the Soviet Union and what was happening there. So, yeah, and they were, you know, really organizing for better paying conditions. And that's what World War II, and the great leaders, Stalin and the Soviet people, they saw the accomplishment of World War II. And there's no way the capitalists could have it was necessary for them to maintain their power to implement welfare and roll out welfare in our country, healthcare, housing, education, because otherwise it would have been a full revolt.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. You said it a lot better than I did. Thanks for that. But yeah, the influence of the Soviet Union in regards to the creation of the NHS was absolutely immense. Just, you're absolutely right. We owe the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 to the existence of the NHS. How the USSR transformed, they electrified and industrialized the country in, you know, less than a decade, pretty much. You know, every single year before the revolution, there was annual famines that killed hundreds of thousands to millions of people in the Russian Empire. And in a matter of 5 to 6 years, these famines were diminished. There was food for everyone to eat. And, you know, just these examples, these international comparisons, you know, Britain was a country that was leading the world in almost everything back then. They had the massive empire at its peak. They had the strongest navy on the planet. They had colonies and access to resources all over the world. They had a colonized population of about 400 million people globally. And yet a few 100,000 workers in Russia armed themselves and fought against the Tsarist government there. And then, you know, boom, you have the first socialist state, and now Britain isn't leading in everything. Now the Soviets are building a massive army, the Red Army, to defend their land against the imperialists. They're building healthcare systems, schools, universities. They're teaching Russian. They're eradicating hunger. They're eradicating illiteracy. They're eradicating, you know, homelessness. Everyone had the right to a job, a safe job. You know, it was just insane. You know, Britain wasn't leading anymore, and the Soviet Union proved that. And yeah, that must have been a tough pill to swallow if you were a member of the British bourgeois back then. But moving on to what Britain was like. I think Sophia touched on it well in her statement. What Britain was like before the NHS. It was horrible. You know, Sophia mentioned that the workhouses. Those were disgusting places. You went there to die. Like your accommodations, you had your little bed, and just next to your bed, you had a coffin. So if you died overnight, your boss would just put you in a coffin, seal the lid, and throw you away. If you died overnight, it was brutal. You went there to die. It was the elderly, it was the sick, it was the weak. You got sent to a workhouse by the court, and you had to work there and live there until you died. And then when you died, you got thrown into a coffin and you got replaced by somebody else. It was a brutal place. That was the pinnacle of the healthcare system back then. There wasn't a healthcare system. There was no infrastructure to help. If you got ill, you got sent there, and most likely, because there was no medicine back then, you'd die there. That was it. If you fell asleep on the job, you'd be beaten half to death by your manager. These kids, you know, 5, 6, 7 years old, getting beat, getting doused with freezing cold water, getting hung up on a cage outside of your workhouse. to humiliate them for being tired on the work when they were working, 13-hour shifts, sleeping 4 hours a day. Brutal conditions. Workplaces were absolutely disgusting. And like Sophia said, sorry, on you go, Sophia. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say they did introduce an insurance. I think it was 1910, 1911. I don't know if you're going on to that. Sorry if I just interrupted you, but they did introduce like a national insurance, a health insurance, but it was tied to your workplace. Sounds a bit like American healthcare, but tied to your workplace. So it's very restrictive and very limited and very expensive, and most of the population couldn't actually access it. But lots of people joined trade unions, but it was more like the friendly societies that people joined, and basically that was in your communities. You would pay a little bit of money every week or month or however often it was, and then you'd get a pot of cash to cover people in the community when they got sick or when they got all ill or were, couldn't work. So there was that. But like I say, that was very late. That was about 1911. And otherwise, again, it's charity. Like I said, that sounds a bit like American healthcare now, doesn't it? But yeah, pretty grim.
No, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was going to get on to that, but yeah, thanks anyway for that. Yeah, definitely. Just before World War One, the government, well, not the government, just communities, self-organized kind of communities started having like a chip-in system where you could volunteer to put money in a kind of a jackpot, a money pot, and then if somebody got sick, they'd be able to use that money. It was municipal socialism, they called it back then, municipal socialism, so socialism at a local level. This kind of municipal, so you could volunteer to take part. You didn't need to, but yeah, just at a workplace or something, everybody could chip in a certain percentage of their wage every week to like this jackpot, or like a rainy day bank. So if somebody at their work did get sick, there'd be coverage there for them. But again, most of the healthcare insurance back then, just before World War One, was linked to your work. And even then, it was very, very little. I mean, alcohol was usually the main prescription people got as a painkiller. They got a shot of spirits and they got sent on their way. If you had back pain or toothache, any of that, you got your tooth removed, you got a shot of spirit, and then you got sent on your way. Now that was your painkiller. You had to pay for that. You had to pay for that back then. There's a quote I love, and its history makes a lot more sense when you realize that we're living in the most sober generation ever. And there's a good point. That was medicine back then. Oh, you have a sore back or a sore tooth or a sore head or anything. You're not feeling too well. You got a flu. Just take some shots of spirits and you'll be fine. If it's a painkiller, it'll last a few hours and you'll be fine. And you had to pay for that. And like Sophia said, there was national insurance, but it wasn't for the workhouses. The people in the workhouses didn't get that. They were too poor to get that. And the kind of work that they had, the health insurance wasn't covered for those kind of work. The workhouses were their healthcare, and there was no healthcare, and they were going to die there. For certain jobs in British society in Victorian times, like teachers, bookmakers, lawyers, stuff like that, dentists, they were slightly higher paid than manual labor and factory workers, so they did get some coverage. But like I said, even then, like that shot of spirits I was talking about, that was their rate. That was their standard of healthcare. That was the good healthcare. That was like the highest tier of healthcare back then. Your painkiller was just drinking some alcohol. Brutal stuff. And it was very specific to certain, like the criteria one was very, very strict, and it was only about certain jobs. It was just brutal. It was such a depressing and miserable time for Britain back then. And it was just before the war. After the war, there was so many more health emergencies that arose during the war and after the war, and the current infrastructure just couldn't support that. And so many people would, like Sophia said, would have rather just died and commit suicide than have went to a workhouse, or they volunteered to join up for the war, hoping that they die at war because they couldn't face the miserable conditions of Britain. So that was what life was like before the NHS. That was the kind of health conditions of Britain back then. And it was probably like other places too. I mean, medicine and technology at this rate just wasn't there yet. And I'm sure, what I just said was no different to anywhere else. Really, most countries back then faced the same, but same issues. But yeah. So if anybody else wants to chip in, Dustin and David haven't spoken in a while, so if you want to say anything, then please do. Just butt in whenever you want.
Well, I mean, with the Australian health system here, I mean, obviously, looking at the history of it, well, what's actually come the realization for it. This wasn't just given to us because of the goodwill of a particular political party or a kind-hearted capitalist or anything like that. It was actually hard fought for by working class people overall, and you have both the external and the internal pressures put on to actually our rulers to actually provide us with some sort form of healthcare. In Australia, we have Medicare. It's a basic health cover. It doesn't cover us for more the advanced surgeries or elective surgeries. It certainly doesn't cover for dental. Dental's still private, but what happened? And compared to the NHS, I think the NHS was much superior compared to what Medicare is. But when I'm looking at the whole history of our health system here in Australia, everything has been dominated by the finance sector. So for insurances and that, I mean, it wasn't until I think it was early 1900s that we actually achieved an old age and invalid pensions. In 1912, introduced a maternity allowance. Then in 1945, the introduction of unemployment and sickness benefits. And that was exactly right. That was because of the influence of the Soviet Union. I mean, in our part of the world down here, the advancement of China moving in by 1949, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and it was spreading right through Southeast Asia and the communist influence. Plus, by 1945, the Communist Party of Australia was actually the biggest political party ever in Australia. No political party ever since has had the numbers they had at the time. We didn't probably have 100,000, but obviously, but still quite substantially for the size of the population here at that time. It was still quite significant. And we also had a trade union movement as well, which is the communist influence in that. Where in Australia, I mean, a lot of the unions were headed by communists. Overall, they played leading roles in a lot of big strikes and advancements for working class people, and which put pressure on the Federal Labor Party to actually introduce these policies in the first place. I mean, John Curtin, who was our wartime Prime Minister, he actually wanted to steer Australia in an independent path, and with the organised militant working class, which was pretty much the majority, along with the Communist Party, and that will actually allowed that we were able to achieve some of these aims, along with actually fighting back against the finance sector, development of the Commonwealth Bank, which was then publicly owned. We were actually able to publicly finance all these benefits we had, but also too through the taxes, so we can actually have a sustainable system. Obviously, that was taken off us for through other consecutive Conservative governments. But it's important to always realise that. And also, too, when a lot of the returned servicemen came back from World War II, there's a generation, they were born during World War One. They've seen the devastating effects they had that on their families. They grew up in practically near poverty. My own grandfather one of them told me, a lot of the times when they went to school, when they left school early, they didn't have shoes. They just walked bare, be it hot or cold, they walked barefoot. If you had a pair of shoes, you only wore them on a Sunday possibly or on a special occasion. So you had to make do. And both my former grandparents lived through the Depression. They knew what it was like to actually have to move around trying to find work. If you had a shilling in your pocket, you saved it, or a penny. You never spent it on a tram or getting anywhere. You kept it as much as you can. And you think of that, they have a lot of majority of working class people, they were malnourished. Most of the diet here, I can't speak for anywhere else, but it was either dripping or syrup. And you're lucky, if you're lucky to get a particular potato at times, or just to try and mix it through. And a lot of actually rabbit hunting became a huge amongst working class people because rabbits were a feral pest here. But rabbit meat was the only sustainable source they could get, but still wasn't really good either. So mostly people were malnourished, rake skinny, and they're lucky to get by. And being on set with World War II, and like like in Britain, a lot of people joined up because they had enough of what was going on at the time. There was also a sense too we had to fight. Was Imperial Japan was coming real close, so that was a very big concern and contributing factor. But also too, the call of the Communist Party, we need to have a united front against fascism, and there's all these combinations of all these three, and by the ending of wartime hostilities in the Pacific and in Europe, a lot of returned servicemen, they were working class, they remembered all what they went through, and they're basically, and they're nice and trained as well, military, and the government, and there was actually marches in the capital cities of returned servicemen with their uniforms on. I said, we've been through all this, we fought for you, we want these X conditions. And that it was organised through the Communist Party and many others. It was quite an impressive scene. So basically, powers that be had to actually start giving major concessions here. What that sickness benefit schemes, was it where the NHS was? Certainly not. Medicare came in much later on, another 40 years later. First of all, we had, after the 1940s, we had 23 years of solid conservative rule. And with the election of the Whitlam government in 72, he did introduce what we call Medibank, which was a precursor to Medicare. When he was sacked after the Whitlam government was dismissed under a CIA soft coup, the Fraser government awarded that back and became like virtually a government-owned health insurance in a sense where it's similar to a private one. It was more corporatised. With Hawke Labor government in 1984, I'm not going to praise Hawke by any means, but they introduced a form of Medicare back into the system, which covered your bare basics. So from doctors' visits, if they bulk billed, well, your doctor was fully compensated through Medicare. If he'd still charge you for having an appointment, you'd have about, say, like 75% return of that cost of the appointment and coverage for basics. And everyone was issued with it. Obviously, for children, it was a lot more free. I'll just show what the Medicare card, we're all issued with that. I'll just share the screen if you don't mind. I'll have a look at this. Share screen. Just bear with me. Share screen.
No worries.
Where are we? That's what I want. This one. Share. Can anyone see that?
Yeah.
So that gives you an example of what a Medicare card looks like. It has your number on there, your name, and obviously you present that to your doctors, and it all goes onto the system. And plus, too, what happens, also too, certain medical information like, COVID vaccines and all that were on there as well for that. But that all became a national system. It's still not, as I said, the same as the NHS. Obviously, we still have to pay for our medical. For our dental care. Dental care is still private. You do need private health insurance. I'll just stop sharing screen. I can see again. We still have to pay for that. And there's certain other areas where we still need to have private health insurance. But majority of the basic health cover and that is still most of that's covered by Medicare. So we do have a form of it. Is it really good? No, it can be actually a lot more improved. But the thing is, what we're fighting, and I've just touched on it before, is the role of finance, the finance sector. They want to have a completely insurance, pay as you go. They want to have the insurance companies dictating to it, and dictating policy and that. There was a proposition years ago to actually include dental care with Medicare, and the pushback by the private sector was huge. The finance sector was huge. So it shows, I won't go into the whole history of the role of the finance sector in the development of Australia, but they've certainly been, that's been primarily a dominant role in Australian policy for a long time. So that just gives you a general outline. So, for example, I have the flu. All right, I need to make an appointment with the doctor. Usually my own doctor bulk bills where I go, so I don't have to pay anything. I just show them the Medicare card, and that's no problem. That's all covered. And obviously there's some pharmaceuticals that are covered through the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. The last time I had a really bad flu was a few years ago. Before anyone heard of COVID. It knocked me out for a week. It really did. And so I was prescribed all that. There was only probably one or two prescriptions I actually had to pay for. So that was But it worked out well. It didn't cost me out of pocket expenses, anything like that. And of course, obviously, we've got sick leave or personal leave we use as well. So that's where our place. So that helped out a lot. But if I needed to probably go through some sort of elective surgery, and that's probably when most. I'll give you no. Actually, I'll take that back. I also had to see a podiatrist once because of my feet. Now, when I see them now, I need a private health insurance for that. That's when I say it's elective or specialist type one. I had to have some inserts developed for my shoes, without the insurance, I would have been paying right through the roof. $800 to $1,000 Australian. So for us, that's a lot of money, and for them, so it just gives you that example where Medicare doesn't cover, which. Really, if we want to talk about a universal comprehensive health system, all that would be covered. And so I'm a little bit jealous of you guys in Britain there with the NHS because it would have been covered. But that gives you I'll just give you one classic example. And Medicare does cover certain workers' compensation cases because obviously workers' compensation is completely different. Most of that is paid through what we call an insurer, and at the point the employer has to pay for. So if you're injured at work and you need ongoing treatment for a period of time, the workers' compensation and insurer looks to pay it. But then after but the problem is there is a cut-off time, and in most states, and then what happens after that, you have to prove the employer was negligent, which could be a long time in the courts for them to pay a big lump sum payout. And then obviously we do have if this is unfortunately it's not universal. We usually have that through union agreements, income protection, where if you're injured outside of work at home, so you're working on the roof of your house, you fell off, broke your arm, and that you need to have some time off work. Well, obviously it's not workers' compensation. Then we allow that the income protection provider, but that's still technically a private side of it. Medicare will only cover some basic costs in that. You'll need to have private health insurance there. So we're not, by all means, I remember, I think it was about late 2000, Barack Obama was coming over here because he was talking about Medicare or Obamacare and that. He wanted to actually look at the Australian system as well. And someone commented he best off actually having a look at the UK model or places where it's universal, because and Dust will obviously elaborate more because the health system, I don't call the US health system. It's just, if it was a health system, then everyone would be, even their basics, they'd be looked after and as well. And I saw that comment in the chat section where one person is, one bloke, he lost his savings, his truck, his trailer, his whole livelihood because healthcare cost him over $500,000. I mean, that is just a tragedy. It's really, that's just dreadful and shouldn't have to ever happen. So anyway, that's pretty much summarised. Just summarising where the Australian system, where it's at the moment. I mean, our fight still still has to continue in order to have a full comprehensive health system. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that, David. That little overview of the current and historic conditions of the Australian healthcare. Thank you very much for that. Very inspirational. And also, I didn't realise that the Communist Party of Australia used to be at one point the biggest party in Australia. That's fascinating. I really like that little fact. Little inspiration. Very inspirational, actually. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. Just dialing back a little bit. I still want Sophia to talk a little bit about, obviously, the problem here in Britain with the gradual privatisation of the NHS.
Can I respond to some of the earlier medicine? I thought it was interesting you mentioned the role of alcohol in earlier medicine. David has an interesting mug. Do you have that mug with you? That coffee cup?
Oh, yeah, it is over on my kitchen sink.
Okay. He got this cool coffee cup, and it says A does not equal A, which is a slogan popularized by the Center for Political Innovation. And, there's these, which is essentially, everything is constantly changing. And there's an interesting phenomenon in American television. Series like The Flintstones. The Flintstones where they have a car, but it's powered by feet. They're still going to like industrial jobs, but it's like the prehistoric age. And then you have the Jetsons. And the Jetsons are like, it's Actually, Jetson was official in the timeline, was born is going to be born a month from now. Apparently, that was a television cartoon show from the 60s, but they're in like futuristic times, and it's still like the 1950s style working class family. There's also the dinosaurs, which is similar to the Flintstones, only with puppetry. The idea is that it's not like that at all. Conditions change. Everyone thinks about how it is now, and they kind of got their outlook. And going back to the alcohol thing, alcohol was a huge part of the medical system, but it was a huge portion of society. If you look at, especially in America, where during the American Revolutionary times, there wasn't as much water purification systems, running water, all this technology we take for general that influences our lives. They had to rely on mostly ale, mostly beer, in America for their source of to be hydrated. So I mean, and then the expression "go home, you're drunk" actually comes back. There we go. A does not equal A. So people would say "go home, you're drunk," because they're thirsty and they're drinking alcohol, and they're like, and it was just normal. It wasn't what we think about it now. There was actually wars in the United States because of the larger distilleries getting favor from the government versus the smaller distilleries, and the whiskey runners and the moonshiners and entire fights and class struggles over alcohol in the United States. That it's completely foreign to our thinking. Another interesting part about the United States in the early medicine is the Civil War in the United States. In the Civil War in the United States, I mean, there was no medical infrastructure. The South is a particularly backwards place. I mean, there was slavery, getting rid of slavery. In North Carolina, I'm not praising the Confederate dead. It's always the poor, that are forced to fight the rich man's wars. Poor white people who were forced to fight for slavery that also kept poor white workers down. 1/4 of the Confederate dead came from North Carolina, and people are still talking about that in the 60s and 70s. A lot of it was to stir racial trouble and continue to keep us divided and keep these right to work states and what have you. But people would get gangrene, they cut off legs. They simply tons of people came from the Civil War would cut off legs and dismembered. It was just disgusting, horrible war with no medical care. And you still see Confederate flags lining the street. You still see historical marks, especially this part of North Carolina. It's insane, what people went through, the history people went through, and modern medicine is and refrigeration, all these things, running water, our life is completely different based on the technology. Sorry, my 2 cents on earlier medicine in society.
No, no worries. We've definitely gone a long way since the American Civil War, Revolutionary War, and those kind of days where the Confederacy and stuff was around. Medicine and technology, we came certainly a long way away from that. But so yeah, I'm gonna give it over to Sophia right now. She has a couple of things to say about the just the gradual privatization of the NHS, which is one of the major problems that the British healthcare system is facing right now. So yeah, I'll just hand it over to Sophia.
Yeah, I mean, the welfare provisions after World War II were only meant to be temporary, just to placate the masses, really. But and the privatization and the dismantling of the NHS started pretty soon after the post-war reconstruction boom. They chipped away at the beginning, and then when the Soviet Union fell, they just kind of took a sledgehammer to it. But there were some fundamental flaws in the NHS. Of course, no system is perfect. So William touched on it. You obviously have it's funded through taxation of the British workers, but it's not, as we know, it's not just the British workers. It's the sweat and blood and toil of the exploited people in all the British colonies as well. And it's the welfare state was shaped by obviously the capitalists and the workers, but the capitalist owns the means of production, so it's always going to sift into their favor. And the NHS wasn't completely equal in its inception. There was still I know private consultants weren't they were contractually free to pursue private medicine. So the capitalist ruling class could actually still get special treatment. So really, the NHS, and I'm not taking away from all the struggles of the people, but it was a calculated move to kind of redirect the revolutionary path. But nonetheless, it was initially the provisions were brilliant, they were excellent. So it was implemented by a Labour government in 1948, but as early as the early 1950s, and bearing in mind it was supposed to be free from cradle to grave, they'd already started bringing in prescription charges, and that was really due to Britain's imperialist aggression against the people of Korea, so the Korean War. So optical and dental prescriptions were being charged for. And then from 1950 to 1980, when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, they underfunded the NHS essentially. They only met their basically the budget needs per year. I think they only met about half of what was needed. So she inherited a bit of a mess, which was perfect and ripe for all the capitalists, because you had 1980, you had Soviet power declining, all the Khrushchevite revisionism and counter-revolution. Although you did have a very strong trade union movement here, but that's exactly what Thatcher went for straight away. 1984 miners' strike crushed the workers' resistance, and then let's have a look at the NHS. And it's funny, but if you're Prime Minister of a country, you want some advice on healthcare. What she did, she called up and sought advice from a supermarket manager. And guess what? The supermarket manager turned around and said, you need to run the NHS a bit more like a supermarket, because, it's not working effectively. It needs to be cost effective. So that's Griffiths. That was the Griffiths report in the early 80s. And Margaret Thatcher actually implemented the internal market within the NHS on April Fool's Day. So the ruling class are really laughing at us. So Robert Griffiths was a director of Sainsbury's. I think he was involved in Monsanto in Europe as well. So essentially what that did, introducing an internal market in the NHS, it's very complicated. The NHS is split into lots of different trusts and organisations. But it meant you had some providers, some purchasers, and they're all competing. So it became competitive, and patients became like customers. And it was a big introduction of a managerial class that, were all about cutting costs, essentially. But she kind of pushed for more private insurance or some tax concessions. But immediately overnight, the administration costs doubled. And look, the reason why the NHS was effective in its heyday was because of central planning. We know that as socialists, we know that central planning is key to the progress. So you had like a collective work of breakthrough medical advancements, and you could really control the distribution of resources as well. But that's, of course, what the capitalists go for first. They try to fragment and kind of divide and devolve it all, so it's just random standalone businesses. So we see that of all of our like public institutions. They defund, it doesn't work. Let's get the private entity in to save the day. And the thing is, that's helped with the media, right? Because the media and the think tanks, I mean, if you go to a hospital and it's all NHS, and then you find out there's a private ward on the hospital and you're not happy about it, why is there a private ward? But we were kind of slowly conditioned to accept that, oh, the NHS, we just don't have the money for the NHS. So that one ward on that hospital that's private, at least that's helping fund the NHS. So it's no problem. So you kind of think, okay, one private ward, that's fine. You go back a few years later and that whole hospital is private and there's only one NHS ward, and that's essentially capitalism. Kind of wants to expand and just like squeeze all the profits out basically. But really, it's not just Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives. The Labour definitely don't give a toss about the NHS. And Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, really, they had more engagement with the private sector than Margaret Thatcher did. And really, Tony Blair's legacy of PFIs and as private financial initiatives, and they're sold like. So it's a positive for the taxpayer, because say you want to build some hospitals, some schools, roads, whatever it is. In this case, it was hospitals. Rather than burden the taxpayer and the government with that initial spending, so say it was 12.8 billion for these hospitals, we will ask the private sector to do it. So private developers, consortiums, they'll build them, they'll design them, build them, maintain them for, I think, up to 60 years, some of the contracts, and we'll just pay it back a bit like a loan. It's all good. Well, 12.8 billion it cost to build these hospitals. The NHS are paying back 88 billion, roughly around 88 from 12. And of course, those are historic debts. I mean, some of the trusts are paying double back to PFI than they're paying on drugs for patients. About 20% of their revenues are going to these loans. And so basically you're locked into banking capital, like you're mortgaged up to the hill. And these hospitals don't run. Like, if you're a private investment firm and you've got, like, what's your motive? You're not going to build to capacity. You're going to build half the amount of beds and wards or whatever it is, open up. Oh no, there's so many NHS patients that can't be seen. Well, lucky you guys, we've got a private hospital that we own around the corner that we can help. So we'll just siphon some of those people off. So PFIs, it's been disastrous, but honestly, it's been so complex, the dismantling of the NHS, and it's actually really mind-boggling that the schemes they hatched. But obvious ones, the cleaners, they outsourced the cleaners first, get rid of them to private sector. What did that do? It was really dangerous, and it was horrendous conditions. And actually, there was uncontrollable antibiotic-resistant infections, widespread. And so it's a catalogue of different things. And then I just want to touch on one more, which was the Health and Social Care Act in 2012. And it actually, basically, it abolished the responsibility of the government to actually provide care to the citizens of this country, only emergency care. And not many people know about that, because we obviously still get all our treatments for free. And if I fall like faint in the street tomorrow, an ambulance be called, I go to hospital and get billed. It's, but this has all been done by stealth and behind closed doors. This year, they have kind of finalized the health and care bill. It's actually become an act. And, all of these parliamentarians, most of them either are in the private sector in these businesses, or they've been promised cushy jobs. So they're obviously passing through all the legislation. But this is really sad this year, right? Because NHS has literally just become a corporate cash cow. So it replicates American Medicaid and Medicare. And so it's publicly funded, but privately controlled and privately delivered. And just to replicate for-profit integrated care, which we're moving on to. But the reason you don't see civil unrest in this country, because the NHS is still popular, is, like I said, we still don't pay at the moment. But it's like in the very inception, they just wait until the conditions are right. And one day you're going to go to hospital and you will get a bill when you get back. And they'll probably pay in China or Russia or whatever. But this is where we're at the moment, and it's devastating. And we'd probably do another chat about COVID, but we were told to stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS, protect the NHS from them more, because it was hundreds of billions that they transferred from public purse to finance capital. And you know what? And all these dodgy contracts, and they were disastrous, multi-million-pound contracts. It was just absolutely nuts. And the NHS wasn't overwhelmed by COVID. It was overwhelmed by the underfunding and cutting, and a lot of our services diminished over COVID, and it's not been brought back. Apparently it's over, but we're not getting the same services back. We still have dentistry. We still, it's quite hard to navigate, but they're slowly, we're getting harder and harder to get these services. I do have a bit of banter because I worked in the social care during COVID, and during lockdown here, everyone went out and clapped, like in the street, like they clapped, obviously just outside your houses because you weren't allowed to leave the area. So you clap. I was like, oh, for the NHS at like 7 o'clock every night. And my mum's a nurse and I like healthcare assistant. And we're like, right, okay, can we cash the claps in? Because we haven't had a pay rise. All these politicians are there clapping and video themselves. I'm like, you voted against a pay rise for years. Do you know what I got? I got a scented candle and like a 6-month subscription to a well-being app. That was my pay rise after working all those hours over COVID. So that's my little rant over there at the end.
No worries. Thanks a lot for that. Beautifully put. And you're right. It's devastating to see what's happening with the NHS. But I thought that was funny during COVID when we all had to stand outside our doors, and because we did that up here in Scotland too. We all just stood and clapped for like maybe 5 minutes every evening. It did absolutely nothing to help. It wasn't even a morale boost. It was more like a condescending, like, yeah, well done. It's like these people are like on their front lines saving lives. They're not even getting the right, personal protective equipment and stuff. They have to wear like garbage bags as protection from the virus. And then we're all just standing here like, oh yeah, well done, we're going to clap. Like, there's absolutely nothing to help anyone. But thanks a lot for that. You raised so many good points, to the fact that like there was an ulterior motive to the beginning of the creation. The government weren't doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. So there was a reason for it. And it did have the intention of just being temporary. It's just a temporary little fix, post-war. And, just seeing the gradual, corporatization and marketization of the NHS, it's really depressing. The NHS stands for such a good thing, just such a virtue in British society, and just to see what is happening. And also, how it isn't just the Conservatives to blame, it is also Labour. Thatcher, Blair was just, like Sophia mentioned, the BFIs, that was Blair that did that. That was the Labour government that did those, corporate little laws putting into the NHS, outsourcing jobs. Now the cleaners are all freelance from private businesses. It's all just, it's fallen apart gradually, and it's really depressing. And like Sophia mentioned, it's done very sneakily. But you raise a lot of points, even more than that. So I'm just going to ask, Dust or David for a response to that, if you want to give a response.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You talk about the advent of neoliberalism, which gutted a lot of positive programs in the United States. Probably a similar instance of something in the United States that we actually had was decent was the American postal system, and a lot of and shout out to the AP, the American Postal Workers Union is one of the strongest unions in this country that fights for decent paying jobs that are in communities throughout the country, raising up wages of Americans. But we recently got, in the same time period, the U.S. Postal Service used to have its own planes. It used to have a monopoly, and now we got UPS and we got FedEx and all this, some union, some non-union. And it's had a devastating effect on our infrastructure as well as our economy and the workers' wages overall. And they would do sneaky stuff like that, trying to privatize the post office to further make money off of it. They actually made the postal workers pay their retirement 75 years in advance. And because of this, the post office was no longer self-sustaining because they had this crazy bill that was destroying them. So they could break it off and further privatize it. And it's crazy. And there was a tax on it in the current election with Trump, but the Democrats also were in on it. And I think that's similar to the period, the decaying imperialism and further neoliberalization. It's interesting to hear.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's always a really bad precedent for the working class when stuff like this happens to working class institutions like the postal service in America and the NHS here in Britain. When the government and the bourgeois, the national bourgeois class just does sneaky stuff like this behind their backs, always has these sneaky little schemes to just destroy our institutions. Um, it's really depressing, and it's just such a negative and quite just demoralizing sentiment.
Yeah.
And it's just really depressing. It's a bad precedent. But yeah, I'll carry on to David.
Yeah, and look, we're no different. It's no different here in Australia with the role of neoliberalism the last 40 years. With healthcare, for example, I mean, more and more people are forced into actually having health insurance. Otherwise, if they earn a certain income, above a certain threshold above income, they have to pay a certain amount back in tax as a levy. Now, when we're talking about universal healthcare, that is applicable to everyone. But what they've done with a group of working class people, they've actually managed to advance their income even further, but only so they can keep ahead in life, are now penalised because they haven't gotten health insurance. And like similar to everyone in Britain, a lot of our health services were actually privatised. We even got private operators in our prisons, not prisons. Oh, we do in prisons, but in our hospitals, like the Spotless of the world, G4S, all these cheerful companies around the world. Spotless is now owned by Downer Corporation. Both from everything from applying, servicing like maintenance sector right through to all sorts of services in hospital where it should have been always public. And when we're talking about all even elective surgeries, but say, for example, you had to be operated on because you've to remove a tumour from your chest, you'd have to have the health insurance take over and take over that because Medicare won't be able to cover they'll only cover the basic cost. But when it comes down to all that advanced costs, you'll need health insurance. And as you get older, you develop all sorts of other health complications. And and so basically everyone is forced to taking out something one way or the other. And here's another thing as well: ambulance car. You need cover for that. Now, if you don't have it in a particular, you need it in insurance. So both if you have a car accident or something happens, you need to be rushed to hospital, you still have to pay for that. And that could cost you $800, $900, up to $1,000. Depends on how far away you live from the hospital. But even transfers between hospital as well. So, for example, you've been in the emergency section, been in this particular hospital, you need to be actually then taken down to another hospital later on for reasons X, Y, Z. You have to pay for that. And if you don't have the insurance, that's a massive expense. So you start working your way up into the thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And this is where it all becomes really, really sinister. And John Howard, when the Prime Minister here from 2006 to 2007, he introduced a lot of these changes as well, and it was because people were just dumping private health insurance. At that time, why did we need it where Medicare could cover most of it? And a lot of them people didn't need it. In fact, so what we've been basically done is put the gun to the head now. No, we've got a legislation. You have to take it, otherwise we're going to tax you more. We'll give you a little insurance rebate, and all it was nothing to do with the health and well-being of the population, not so ever. It's about keeping finance capital going. That's all it was, how they can extract more and more and more. And it goes even to aged care now. Aged care is being privatised, and during the height of COVID, it showed a lot of problems with our aged care. It really exposed it even more, but how our aged care elderly people are treated in aged care is appalling. But it's all run by private industry. They're going on about how wonderful they are, coming to this particular nursing. Your care, your health and care is our primary concern. No, it's not. It's profit. And the amount of mistreatment and ill treatment of elderly people who can no longer care for themselves in aged care is deplorable. It should never, ever, ever been privatised. It should be a publicly funded area, and especially for those who basically done the hard fight over years and everything else. It's up to the population. It's up to the public to take care of these people instead of being left to private capital. So, God help you, for a lot of people who are now past retirement who are concerned about have to go to aged care, it's more or less just, it's like a death sentence going in there alone. You should be actually have a reasonable quality of life. Now, if you haven't got a really good income and if you haven't really got some assets behind you and that, you're lucky to even get the bare basics. You just wait until the day you jump off the perch and and that's it. And they've taken as much possible. And if you do accrue any debt, well, that just go on to your children. They'll have to pay that off. So you could just say this is where the system's no longer able to provide. It's in crisis, but also it's no longer obliged to provide. We have to, and actually a clear lesson where I mean, for working people here, a very big clear eye opener. We actually have to fight for this again. We have to actually fight to get it all back, and it's going to be a long fight. And I think one question of people when we're talking about private about a universal healthcare system. That also, well, I do look at Cuba. I mean, they've got treatments, and it's you're all looked after. You've got treatments for cancer. They know.
We'll be talking about Cuba later on.
Yeah, and all that. So, all right, we'll talk about Cuba later on. But I just like to throw it in the face of people who are ever in doubt. That's all. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks a lot. Yeah. It's hard to talk about healthcare. Living in a capitalist country, it's hard. It's quite demoralizing sometimes, and it's rough to talk about. It's quite demoralizing, and I'm afraid before we start talking about good stuff like Cuba and the Soviet Union, there's a couple more things that are going to be quite negative. We have to get through first before we get to the good stuff. We're obviously going to end the live stream on a good note, so that's why we're leaving Cuba and the Soviet Union to the end. We talk about that at the end, so it's a positive end. But moving on to our next kind of point is about the American healthcare system in a little bit more detail. So from what I understand, the American healthcare system is pretty much the opposite of the NHS and the British healthcare system. Nothing is pretty much free. You have to pay for everything from the ambulance to the hospital. That's a chargeable thing. Room service and stuff like this. That's my understanding anyway. Like nothing is free. You have to pay for everything. And there's different rates of national insurance based on what job you have and stuff. Like there's different tiers or like levels, and depending on how good your job is, it depends on what quality of healthcare treatment you receive and stuff. That's kind of what us Brits are told about the American healthcare system. I'm not sure if that's right. You can correct me if that's not true, but that's kind of what we're told here. That's like how Britain looks at the American healthcare system. Nothing's free. You have to pay for everything, and like it's very classist. Like there's different tiers that pretty much define how you're going to get treated in hospital. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I can talk about the history of the U.S. healthcare system and how it developed. The United States is interesting. If we go all the way back to after the Civil War and in the early 1900s, there was a lot of these associations like the YMCA, a lot of Christian associations, the Salvation Army. These are like charity organizations that like feed the poor, and they were basically the extent of the American healthcare system. And a lot of libertarians love to say, "Oh, government healthcare is evil." And these evil corporations, and they'll say, "Oh, these evil monopoly corporations." The libertarians will talk about, how these evil monopolies are hurting us. But we only need to go back to those good Christian associations of the late 1800s, and it's ridiculous because if you look at like what they actually provided and what they had, it was very very limited. And then if we look, and then what it really started to change was further monopolization, industrialization, the advent of Henry Ford and the assembly line. And this is where, it kind of restructured society away from these smaller factories, more communal, to these huge companies, and everyone being tied to this rising industrial economy in the United States. And it really developed like Britain, where it was, healthcare was in with your job. It became attached with your job, and the union movement fought for healthcare. And then if we go up into World War II, what we're told about the British system, what I was told in history, is that because of Britain was physically attacked by the Nazis in the planes, they had to respond to that, and that's why. But the United States wasn't physically hit. That's what we're told. And we're never told about the union movement, the strong union movement that people actually fought for. Oh, it was just because they were attacked by the Nazis and they had to do it. But our system's still better. somehow, it's kind of ludicrous. So if we let's talk about what happened in World War II. Was the FDR's programs and the Great Depression early on were very negative. They had the communists criticized this. I recently, libertarians bring this up and say, oh, government's evil, because earlier in the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, to raise prices, was destroying livestock while people were hungry, destroying food while people were hungry. But later on, it kind of shifted. There was actually a fascist. There was an attempted fascist coup against Roosevelt. There was a strong communist party, and then to stay in power, Franklin Roosevelt had to rely on the Communist Party to an extent, and was allied with the Soviet Union. So there was a lot of wonderful things like the TWA and Social Security and all this great stuff that was fought for by the communists in the United States during the 40s. Healthcare wasn't one of them. There was a lot going on. But what did happen, what definitely got us out of the depression was the kind of the beginning of the military-industrial complex, and this production for war, which further industrialization, further monopolized the economy, and this production for war really became the U.S. industrial society, and really hooked in that 1950s Leave It to Beaver, Dad Goes to Work, the beginnings of the labor aristocracy. All the healthcare is hooked to your job. After they destroyed Japan and Germany, the U.S. was the industrial superpower of the world. So that's where it got hooked to. Then let's get into the collapse of the labor aristocracy. You're starting to get into the 70s. Okay, now before black and brown folks, they never had health care, really. Trying to say, because it is very tier. What good job you have or what don't good job you have, really depends on what kind of health. You're right about that. But then you get the loss of the labor aristocracy, you get offshoring, neoliberalism, the destruction of the union movement. First, we had the destruction of the Communist Party in the 50s, and then Reagan. The big y'all talked about the miners' strike. In the 1980s, it was the air traffic controllers. The destruction of the air traffic controller strike was really the beginning of the downfall and the absolute dismantling of the American labor movement. And after that, all those benefits that were won by workers, by communists, that were hooked into the employer, higher fees, less good care, and then the advent of neoliberalism. Oh, and it just went crazy. Huge pharmaceutical companies, monopolies on the institutions themselves, the hospital monopolies. They have absolute control over our healthcare system. There's little to no regulation at all. It's an absolute horror show. Insurance companies don't barely pay anything. They just siphon off money. You go into the doctor's office, you have no idea how much they're going to charge. You can go into debt very, very easily, destroy your credit. It's almost like the healthcare system is used to reinforce class oppression. So it's like if you have a little bit, if you have a decent job, it keeps your credit straight. Medical debts, they're forgiven in a few years, but it destroys your credit. So it's like this two-tier society of people who have good credit and people who don't have good credit. If you don't have good credit, that means you're going to be paying a higher deposit. You're less likely to find a house. You're even less likely to find a good job if your credit gets destroyed. It further reinforces the keep a lower section of the working class in poverty and staying in poverty and staying in desperate situations where and because the little bit of health insurance that's hooked to that work, you don't even want to leave that work. So your insurance sucks, but at least I got it. My credit sucks. I can't get good loans. I can't get anything. I can barely get any housing, and I'm stuck in this crappy job, and there's nothing I can do about it. And then you got people. The co-pays are so high that you don't even want to go to the doctor if you have health care. So people will be like, oh, I'm not going to go to the doctor for anything. Like, oh, I sprained my ankle, I broke my arm, the hospital's on its way. There's the scene in Breaking Bad, which is an interesting television show, which never would have happened in the United States, about a teacher who gets cancer and then has to become a crystal meth dealer to pay for his health care so his family doesn't go into ruin. And in the ambulance, and this is common, on the ambulance, the way to get, after having a huge medical episode, he's like, hey, it's okay, I'm not feeling that bad, I don't have the best insurance, please don't take me to the hospital. I'd rather risk death from this health issue I have than risk the financial ruin that could be brought upon me by bringing me to the hospital and destroying my credit, destroying my ability to get home, housing, and transportation to get to and from work. It's absolutely ridiculous what's going on, and the only time they tried to do something about it or remedy about it, we have 60,000 Americans die every year because of a lack of any healthcare system whatsoever. It's an absolute tragedy. And when they tried to do something about it, when Barack Obama came into office, this was right after the Bush administration, the horrible Iraq war, the crashing of the economy in 2008, and we have a black presidents, which I go along with Glenn Ford. It was a black face on white power. This was an absolute representation of the banks. This was a continuing of the Bush war doctrine, imperialist doctrine, which only spoke more elegant. And what he wanted to do was get health care. And the fight was interesting. The corporate money went straight into these right-wing, semi-fascistic organizations, a manipulation of the Tea Party, which was kind of it started out as a libertarian movement, but then it was pumped full of corporate money. And when they put the corporate money into the Tea Party, they twisted it into a fascistic, hardcore anti-commune, red baiting fucking shock troops. And when Obama said he was going to do something about healthcare, they mobilized this ignorant, backwards portion of the population to completely stop him and gut anything that was going to be healthcare whatsoever. And Barack Obama won't even down to fight for it to begin with, because he was a corporate tool. So when they were trying to get the Affordable Healthcare Bill, they introduced it originally with something called a public option. And a public option ain't even Medicare. It ain't Medicare for all. All a public option was a publicly run insurance industry, a publicly run insurance company that may have brought down prices overall because it would have competed with the private companies. And Barack Obama took it off the table from the beginning. Wanted nothing to do with it. The Affordable Care Act became a subsistence for private insurance companies, because it put out the mandate, which was the right wing was mad about, and I think communists should have been mad about the mandate too. Basically, it said that it went to the Supreme Court, and it said that it's considered a tax, it's constitutional. All Americans have to buy private insurance, or they're going to be taxed, or they're going to be penalized for not buying a private service, and there won't even be no public option. So I mean, and eventually the right wing fought to got rid of that, which a lot of people say it further weakened the Affordable Care Act. But Affordable Care Act ended being this mishmash of some basic laws. Like, things were so crazy. We had these things called pre-existing conditions. And pre-existing conditions where if you had cancer before you bought the insurance, then cancer wasn't going to be covered even though you had health care because you had it before. It was a pre-existing condition. That's how crazy and like anarchistic our healthcare system was. There was some basic regulation that was passed with the Affordable Care Act, but there was also like mandates for the insurance companies. And there was an interesting part of the Affordable Care Act was they were going to expand Medicare to more portion of the poor. And what they did was the old right wing, former Confederacy, folks, states' rights folks, got it in there that the states could decide whether they wanted to accept the federal funding or not. So in the South, when they were supposed to send North Carolina specifically, when they wanted to expand Medicare in North Carolina, if you're a working male and you're poor, you do not qualify for anything. If you're a working age male in North Carolina with no children, there is no public assistance on healthcare whatsoever. And they were supposed to expand that to cover this group. And because the states were allowed to opt out, there's this whole sections of lower class workers who have no assistance whatsoever. And then the tier up from that was the government's going to offer assistance to insurance companies. They basically gave tons of public money directly to insurance companies to help subsidize some health care and some basic regulation. But I mean, still, tens of thousands of people are dying every year because of lack of health care. It can mean financial ruin at any moment in time, and it's used to reinforce a low credit, low wage, lower portion of the working class. I know I said a lot there. Y'all can respond.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much for that lengthy overview of that. I found that most of that really, really informative. People in Britain are not taught about that kind of history at all. Everybody, in Britain kind of makes fun of the American healthcare system, but we don't actually know anything about the history. So thanks a lot for that, providing that history, because we're left in the dark here in Britain about that kind of history. And one thing that I think there's similarities between everything we talked about, the British healthcare system and then the American and the Australian, that the trade union movement and communists had a massive part in fighting for healthcare in our respective countries. If it wasn't for us and our struggle, we wouldn't be where we are right now. And that's one kind of thread I found in David's kind of overview about the Australian healthcare system, and then what you just said there, the trade union movement and communists in general have had a massive influence on fighting for healthcare, and it just shows that healthcare and the right to a government that actually looks after your physical health is an inherently socialist thing. Every single socialist, left, right, and centre in history has fought for it, and every single workers' movement, that's been one of their first demands. A good universal healthcare system. It's in the Workers' Party of Britain 10-point programme. It's in the party programmes of the CPGBML. It everywhere. From Cuba, like we're going to talk about soon. So healthcare is an inherent part of what we do in our work, and no one can take that away from us. And yeah, struggle is a huge part of that. It'll take a very hard struggle for that kind of healthcare system that we need, especially the Americans and Australians and most people on the planet really need. It's going to take a lot of fighting and a lot of struggle. But I don't know if David or Sophia wants to respond to anything that Dust said. Yeah, Sophia?
That's absolutely horrifying. We're the American healthcare system is like the most horrifying thing to Brits, and this is why It's absolute political suicide to even suggest anything other than an NHS. And this is why they've done it by stealth. They've done it, behind closed doors, and every single government and a party will say they're for the NHS, despite all of them behind closed doors privatizing it to the hill. But yeah, I mean, like I say, we're there now. We're basically at that American healthcare system, but they're picking their moment, because there will be civil unrest. And that Breaking Bad program you're talking about, Dust, would be very, very boring. It wouldn't be an episode long. It would be, I've been diagnosed with cancer, I'm going to the doctors to get treatment here, and I would be below the bad credit. I've had so many surgeries, and it's not just like long hospital stays I've had. It's a physiotherapy afterwards. It's months of, had to pay prescriptions. I think prescriptions are up to about £9.30 now, and people kick off about that. But it would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands, everything. I looked up a shoulder surgery I had, and I had to stay in hospital for a few days. And I looked it up, and in America it would have cost like $90,000. Like something, not a penny spent. I spent £10 on some drugs afterwards for a little while, and I was fine. But it's hard to comprehend. That's why it's all hush here, because nobody's against the NHS. They'll moan about it till the cows come home, but nobody's against it.
Yeah, Sophia, you're absolutely right. We take it for granted here in Britain. We always moan about like, oh, we have to pay like a tenner for a prescription now, but it could be a lot worse. When I was diagnosed with cancer, I did research on how much it would cost me if I was in America with the kind of treatment I was on. And that included 2 surgeries and about 2.5 months of pretty intense chemotherapy. It would have been like $700,000. Obviously, I don't know, like that's just like the standard average rate. I would have probably got a discount because of my financial situation and stuff. But even then, like maybe £500,000 for something I had no control of getting. It's absolutely insane. So yeah, it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely devastating to see people, in the most advanced capitalist society in the world, the most powerful economy in the world, people have to go through it on a daily basis, have to worry about those kind of things. Yeah, go on, David.
Yeah, and can I just say too, what I've got to say here for Australia, it's been a gradual withering away. It hasn't been like a big instant hit and taken suddenly off you. They've gradually taken it away. And then I look at the United States as the lowest common denominator for healthcare. And for us in Australia, that's what we're facing too. It's all right, we'll take that little bit first. We'll take that little bit further. Oh, well, that doesn't, and some people, it doesn't bother me. I don't have to see that. But as that starts happening, one day when we actually do need it, oh my God, I haven't got anything anymore. And that's it. Look, I mean, we've got an aging population as well. No one's young forever. And also too, we've got a population living longer than it was, say, in mid-1980s when Medicare was first introduced. The average, back in 1984, the average lifespan for a male was around about 75 years. For a female, 78. But now we're getting people living well into their 80s and their 90s. So even, let's say, 100-year-olds, people reaching 100 is a lot more commonplace than it was when I was a young child. So people, obviously, health insurance, I'll take that back, but healthcare has to be pertaining for them. But if they don't have money or that to look after themselves, they're basically up shit creek. And we all are in one way or the other. And they're saying, oh, no, unless you've got a good job paying at a particular insurance or whatever else, well, sorry, that's next to nothing. We're actually, basically, the healthcare system ceases to basically exist. It's no longer a healthcare system. Because healthcare is looking after the population. Well, then it must mean cease being there. Yeah, it's there. The hospital's there, but you can't use it if you don't have the money. And that's what they're trying to actually do here for Australia as well. But as I said, what once used to be covered quite comprehensively, it's shocking to believe how much now is being taken over to the private sector, and compared to what it was all those years ago. But just for the warning of the people of Australia, this is where we're heading if we don't do something about it.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, thanks, Steve. Appreciate that. So let's leave this live stream on a positive note. Let's talk about some good examples of healthcare systems around the world, some international comparisons and examples. First off the bat, we're going to talk about Cuba. Cuba is one of those things. It's one of the most inspirational things in the world right now. Cuba is leading the world in a lot of things right now, and it's so unlikely given its history. Not too long ago, it was under the Batista family rule, and they were puppets of the US, and all this brutal stuff. It was a slave society, pretty much. Well, not pretty much. It was a slave society. They were open about that. They had slaves. They had a slave market, and just brutal stuff. And in a good few decades, they've almost completely industrialized, and they're having these massive breakthroughs in technology and in medicine and in science. They have vaccines against cancers now that are unavailable in every single other country. They have vaccines against lots of different viruses that don't have vaccines anywhere else. They were the first country in the Caribbean to eradicate mother-to-child transmission of certain diseases. During the pandemic, they sent thousands of their own doctors to Africa to help deal with outbreaks in Africa, because in a lot of Western African nations, there's not really a very strong healthcare infrastructure there. So Cuba sent their brigades. When America were sending brigades to countries, military brigades to terrorize and occupy people, Cuba were sending very different brigades, medical brigades to Africa to help them during a massive pandemic. And Chris, definitely have new treatments for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's too. Lots of dementias, stuff like that. They're just every single day, it seems they're finding these new breakthroughs. Every single day they're working on something new. Cancer vaccines. Some cancers are now literally curable now, thanks to the socialists in Cuba. There might be one day in our future where there's a cure for Alzheimer's. People don't have to die of Alzheimer's. That's a very realistic possibility now, thanks to the work that the Cuban socialists are doing. Just socialist Cuba continues to lead the way in many, many things, and with their partnership with China, China is a massive financial help to Cuba. But I mean, honestly, I think Cuba can do it on its own. Cuba is under an absolutely intense embargo, a complete blockade. Most countries in the world don't trade with them, because if they do, the United States will demonize them and make them the enemy. So Cuba is under one of the strictest blockades in the world, and still they're managing to do all this under the restrictions. Just think of what Cuba would manage to do and manage to achieve if they weren't under such harsh embargoes. Like, they'd be able to do hundreds times more of what they're doing now, and they're doing amazing things as it is. It's completely inspirational. Just the kind of things they're doing. So I don't know. Yeah, please chip in away. Let's just have a general conversation about socialist healthcare, specifically Cuba and the Soviet Union. If you want.
I just want to know. I know I went way over on my topic, but we're running a little short on time. Were you going to talk about the Soviet Union as well? Maybe if you could finish talking on the Soviet Union. And then we have a round of concluding statements.
Yeah, sure thing. So just one last point. The Soviet Union as a historical example, again, absolutely incredible. It just shows the superiority of socialist healthcare compared to capitalistic healthcare, and the difference it actually takes putting people before some sort of corporate profit. Before the 1917 revolution, like in Britain, there was absolutely no healthcare infrastructure. There's nothing really that they can do. People died of toothache in Russia. Farmers and agricultural workers didn't bother. They just drank alcohol like everybody else to suppress the pain, I guess, if they could afford to get it. It's just brutal times. And in a matter of decades after the communist revolution, the first ever communist revolution, the Soviet Union was the first ever socialist state. Oh, I mean, in a matter of decades, they had highly technological hospitals who were functioning. They had massive training. In a matter of about 20 years after the creation of the Soviet Union, they had medical brigades going to different countries, training foreign people. They were traveling to Africa, they were traveling to Western Europe, they were teaching us. These Soviet scientists and researchers were coming to us and teaching us about these new methods and stuff that they'd found out that we would have never even knew about if it wasn't for them. In a matter of decades, they completely electrified and industrialized the country. You know, Dental care. They started actually taking care of people's health. They started looking at diet. They were looking after. They were monitoring what their people ate to make sure that they were having a healthy, balanced diet. They weren't eating, they weren't undereating or overeating. They had a healthy, balanced diet. They encouraged physical exercise. They encouraged working out and exercise and having a good physical shape. They wanted hardworking people. All these things were encouraged and thought about. The Soviet Union, I think, was the first country in the world that looked beyond physical health. The Soviet healthcare system was the first healthcare system that it wasn't just physical, it was mental, it was cosmetic as well. I guess if that's something that you're interested in. It's just the history of the Soviet Union is so inspirational. It was the first country to legalize abortion. All these things that they discovered mental illnesses that never would have been discovered, and they worked on treatment for those mental illnesses, and they saved the lives of hundreds of millions of people, not just in their own country, but in every other country on the planet. They led the world, like Cuba is now. They led the world in so many things like medicine breakthroughs and vaccines. They were the first. They were one of the first countries to make I can't remember what vaccine it was, but they made loads of vaccines throughout their time that helped save tens of thousands of lives. So, I'll mention this again in my closing statement, but I mean, socialist healthcare is infinitely superior to capitalist healthcare. I cannot stress this enough. You can't be a communist if you're not going to take healthcare seriously. And I mean, the NHS is an amazing thing, but even communists, we would have something even more than that. We could have so much more than even what the NHS is now. We could have so much more than that. So socialists, we have to fight for real, genuine, socialist healthcare. We shouldn't just take the shit that we get given by our national bourgeois classes. We should fight for more, because the Soviet Union and Cuba are amazing examples of what more could mean for us. So yeah, that's kind of my closing statement too, I guess. So I'll let's go, David. Let's hear your closing statement.
Okay, well, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. It's such a huge topic. And I think for us here in Australia, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the United States and around the world. And I think actually using the socialist model of Cuba, Soviet Union, and plus many others, China and Vietnam as well, we want to make our comparisons with our health system to theirs. They are well in advance. I mean, Nancy, who would ever thought we'd have vaccines and treatments for cancers like they do, where people can live long and meaningful lives and fruitful lives, where with someone to like ourselves in Australia here, it can be just we're just looking forward to a death sentence instead. We look at these countries that look after our aged care, and I've noticed the comment here about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's treatments, and dementia is a huge issue here in Australia as well. My own dad's got it. It is a tragic thing, and especially once they stop recognising, and that it can be quite painful for the immediate family. But seeing someone go through all that is not a first-hand experience. It is really sad as well, and there should be actually, under a socialist system, it'd be taken care of. There'll be actually treatments put in place. We'll be putting looking towards to actually cures. Not just actual treatments, but actual cures, putting more money into it, investment into it. COVID's another one I just want to summarise. A classic one case with COVID here, when people didn't want the mandates, and the governments were trying to enforce compulsory mandates and vaccinations. Now, the fact is, the question was never asked, why the hell then, why can't our health system cope with all this in the first place? And they should have been actually putting major investments, major public health infrastructure put in place, reopening our hospital wards, which were closed down years ago, increasing the nurse-patient ratio as well, increasing our doctors, offering young people opportunity to work in the medical professions. And all that way we can actually have a genuine and a proper health system like what we have, instead of hearing on the news all the hospitals have to go in brown alert because of increases in COVID and people entering into intensive care units, etc., when we should be having abundance of all that in the first place. None of that was mentioned. It said their Band-Aid solution was, oh, well, we'll just have a compulsory vaccine instead. That'll cure it. No, it had nothing to do with our health whatsoever. It was a matter of keeping the system going, making more profit, and that's all it was. And I think, like I said before, I think for us in Australia, a big lesson to be learned, we look at what's happened in the US as well with the health system there. And the question I want to leave it off this summary, is this where we really want to go?
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. You left on a good note there. Okay, I'll carry it to Sophia for your closing statement.
Yeah, I think the key to socialist success and in socialist countries regarding health is really they actually care about closing the gap. So they don't consider like health as just going to the hospitals. It's about food, it's about education, it's about housing, it's the whole thing all together. And really socialist medicine as well, and is about meeting the needs of the people and the ability of the socialist countries, the ability for them to plan. And like what's been discussed tonight is really that capitalism is in crisis, and they're like frenziedly like looking for profitable avenues. And we're kind of like held to ransom by private industry, aren't we? But because the imperialists don't care. They will seize any assets, any public assets, no matter how essential it is for local people. It's that's capitalism. But on a positive note, our chair Ella Rule of the CPGBML contributed to the CPC and World Marxist Political Forum this week, and I was lucky to attend, and it was really, really hopeful and inspiring. And obviously we talked about China, but Marxist parties all over the world, and really like what they wanted to emphasize was that as Marxists we have a shared responsibility to like adapt and apply Marxism to our national conditions, which we've all talked about, and they're all different, but we can obviously see threads that are similar. So we got to just really like shine a light on everything that's happening, and really that socialism is the guide to action. So it's the way forward.
Beautifully put, Sophia. Thank you very much for that. And last but not least, let's move it on to Dust.
I just want to say thank you so much, William, for organizing this and sharing, as well as Sophia. Thank you so much for she actually took the initiative and came with us with this idea because she was troubled about the privatization of their national resource. The healthcare system is being destroyed. The imperialists, the monopoly capitalists are behind the scenes destroying the healthcare system of the British people. And all it takes is to flip a switch, and then they're going to be in the same situation we're in. I just want to thank you so much for coming on here and being able to speak. And anybody watching this who's concerned about an issue, wants to learn more about an issue, please reach out to me on Facebook. Please email us at Working Class Revolt. We are a people's forum, and we can talk about an issue that concerns you. And we'd love to have you on. I think I'm going to end in two parts, and I think it's absolutely amazing what the Cubans have done with so little resources under a blockade. When the people actually want to invest in something and do something, they can do it, and they can do amazingly through collective effort and not through the siphoning off of profits from the capitalists. Cuba's a great example of that. And I think we cannot fail to mention what China has done and their huge, successful, and democratic healthcare system. China is a vast country with one of the largest populations on earth. And it's interesting, they have a very federalized healthcare system that is almost directly controlled by the people themselves. And it varies from different region to different region. And they're a proud and strong country with different, different ethnicities, different regional cultures. And those, instead of being destroyed by monopoly capitalist culture being enforced, those different cultures and different regions are being respected. And there was no greater test of the healthcare system of China than COVID. COVID sprung up first in China, and the U.S. and the Western media attacked them. But they jumped into action. They had the supplies because the government actually cares about the people and works for the benefit of the people in the society. And they were able to stop COVID in its tracks. The zero COVID policy did absolute wonders. It saved hundreds of thousands of lives. When the United States was fumbling around making sure that U.S. pharmaceutical companies were going to make money off the tests, the Chinese were ready to manufacture tests and then test the entirety of the population. And they were able to have less lockdowns, preserve personal liberty more than the United States. Because they had the test, they knew where it was coming from. So they were able to shut down sections of city blocks, sections of cities, different regions without shutting down the entire economy. And they were largely able to keep their manufacturing going. Believe it or not, China's effective medical system and zero COVID strategy saved the global economy, because they were able to keep production going while the rest of the world had to shut down production because they were so on top of the ball. I think that ends it for China. I want to talk also about the fight for healthcare in the United States. The sheepdog imperialists, Bernie Sanders, AOC, have been exposed by the populist movement. Jimmy Dore and the fight for Medicare for all, the push for Medicare for all, where they tried to convince the sheepdogs, AOC and the squad. They said, hey, Nancy Pelosi, one of the worst, disgusting capitalist imperialists in human history. Hey, don't vote for her again. Force the vote. Don't vote for her again unless they bring Medicare for all to the floor, so we can save 60,000 Americans from dying every year. And the sheepdogs refused to do it. And the corporate media refused to go out and cover the Medicare for All march. And this election cycle, I'll probably be writing in Brother Jimmy Dore for president, to show that this is a necessary issue and we can no longer depend on the two-party system or even the sheepdogs and the fake imperialists that say they want health care but aren't ready to listen to the people.
All right, man. Thanks for that. What an awesome and positive note to leave on. Thanks a lot for that. And just one last little thing before we go. Our tradition here at Working Class Report, our just little mantra. So if we can, all of us here on the stream, put our left fist up in the air and repeat after me. Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare to win.
All power to the people.
All power to
the people.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Right on.
Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.